My name is Bhagwan Chaudhary. I'm a professor of finance at the Indian School of Business, ISB. Today, I'm speaking with a longtime friend who was also a professor at ISB many years ago, and now he teaches economics at the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi. He's an economist, but he's also a statistician, and I think of him as a statistical detective, a sleuth, so to speak. Truth leaves a lot of signs. And when you lie, you only fix one thing, you don't fix the context. And that's how detectives find out that you're lying. For example, in GDP is supposed to measure economic activity, and the official figures. Economic activity is high, there will be other signs like consumption of power, or fuel consumption, or the amount of miles traveled. So when you try and fix one thing, you have to simultaneously fix all those things to be able to do a good job, and that is very hard to do. And that's what statisticians can discover by night lights and other such measures.
Okay. Absolutely.
Now, let's come to the current situation where we are talking about health data. How many people are infected? How many people are dying? What's going on now?
So this is a paper that I am working.
It's interesting. I like the title of your paper, Death, Data, Deviation, and Democracy. Okay.
So what I did was I looked at the data from Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins has a very vast data set available across the countries in terms of total number of cases, terms of total number of deaths, total number of recoveries. Okay. And something which was of interest to me was to relate this data to the different kinds of government regimes. That if you were to look at the data from China, which is where the virus has originated, they had 90,000, almost 90,000 cases, and within a matter of 20 to 25 days, the country saw rapid recovery. And you could almost fit a normal curve to the active cases and recovery. That kind of statistical fitting, would be only plausible if you had some kind of data that has been manufactured.
So the idea of democracy is that authoritarian governments would be able to manipulate this more versus democracies, because there are checks and balances, and many people looking at the data, they will be able to do it less.
Absolutely, absolutely, spot on. And this is where I thought, the whole scenario of relating the data to the government regime becomes extremely interesting. And you see, what the countries can do essentially is that if you think about death, from a statistical perspective, if I were to tell you, let's say there are 1,000 cases and 1% of people are going to die, then the expected number of deaths in a given day is going to be 10. But in reality, this number can actually fluctuate. If you were to model this through a binomial process, on a day-to-day basis, this number will fluctuate around a certain average, which is 10, but it would never be perfect 10.
Correct.
Now, if countries are manipulating data, and why is death data important to manipulate? Because death reflects, to a certain extent, the institutional capacities of the country. The death reflects, to a certain extent, not more so in terms of cases, but more so in terms of death, what institutional arrangements you have to take care of people who have fallen sick due to this virus. And you will notice, if you look at European countries, for example, and look at the mortality rate per million people, it differs a great deal from countries to countries. In Belgium, you would have 700 to 1 million people are dead, whereas in Germany, that number is 70 to 1 million people. Right, so there's a great deal of variation that exists across countries.
So this is a really, really insightful point. Your point is that the data is much more random in reality, whereas if you try to fake data, they are not able to replicate the same degree of randomness. It looks too smooth for it to be random. And that's a way of detecting it. This change in pattern is a way of detecting that something has been done to this data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so this is what we were trying to detect in the data, basically. That look, there is a randomness to the data. There is, typically what you would do is you would construct some kind of a moving average around this number, and you would see movements of the data around the moving average. But what you wouldn't see essentially is data absolutely fitting well to a particular moving average.
Yeah.
So if countries are trying to manipulate their death data, then what they would be trying to do is that they would try to sort of come up with what is the comfort level of daily death which people will accept
Yes.
versus something that people will not be comfortable with. But in democratic countries,
in fact, this idea in mathematics is quite well known that human beings are very bad at producing random sequences. Human beings produce sequences that are almost too smooth. I remember a famous paper where I think it was the guy who wrote Freakonomics. He detected cheating in Chicago schools because he saw that the numbers that were being created were too smooth. They wouldn't have been generated naturally. So you're using the same insight here. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. So basically then we said, okay, let's test this across regimes. And we use the Economist Intelligence Unit. They have a democracy index, which they come out every year since 2006, which allows us to look at a country and identify what kind of regime they have. They typically, you will have four kinds of regimes. One is authoritarian regime where you don't have any civil rights.
Let's see that.
Where you don't. So you have authoritarian regime in which you don't have any elections. Basically, these are outright dictatorships. Then you have hybrid regimes where you might have elections, but there are no civil rights as such. There's no freedom of the press as such. There's no independent judiciary, and opposition is harassed all the time. And then you have flawed democracy. And let me tell you, US is a flawed democracy. Italy is a flawed democracy. These are places where you have free and fair elections.
And are you willing to say India is a flawed democracy?
Yes, India too is a flawed democracy, where by and large you have civil rights, but sometimes there is an infringement on the freedom of the press. But India is not the only country in this. I mean, you have large countries like the US, Italy, and then you have full democracies where you have proper checks and balances, where one institution's powers are restricted by the other. And these are called full democracies. So basically, economists...
What are the examples of full democracy? Or is it just...
You have Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland. So these are countries with full democracies. Yeah.
So now you're saying that you will be able to relate it. You'll say the degree of manipulation as measured by the smoothness is likely to be related to how authoritarian the government is. Is that where we're going?
Yeah. So let's just look at the raw numbers. Forget about any analysis. I mean, what is appealing about this study essentially is that you have 4 million cases, COVID cases that have been reported. And almost 80% of them are in democracies, full and flawed democracies. But when you look at the death data, 92% of deaths have been reported in full and flawed democracies, but only 8% of the deaths are in authoritarian and hybrid regimes.
Something suspicious. Okay.
Now the question essentially is, one could say that, look, democracies are more open to trade. Democracies have more mobility of people, so the infection could spread very rapidly. But if you look at it in per thousand people as well, the numbers are not, sort of a gradient. They are a multiple. So if you look at, for example, on a per capita basis, if you just look at the death, it is 0.6 per thousand people, whereas per 100,000 people, whereas in full democracies, it's almost 40 times at 25.7 per 100,000 people. So basically, you have democracies which account for 48% of the population, but they're accounting for 92% of the deaths. Look at countries. Yes. So if you look at countries...
This is very interesting because you're saying the cross-country comparison allows us to detect it because The disease doesn't know the boundaries, right? It doesn't know
Yes.
that it's in Poland or in India. So the patterns should be similar. But
Yeah.
the fact that the patterns are starkly different is suggestive of some kind of data manipulation.
We constructed a 7-day moving average. So we have daily data right from when the first case is discovered in a country, right up till we did this for 9th of May, but we do it on a daily basis. And what we plot is we plot the 7-day moving average and we look at the actual values around the moving average. You notice in authoritarian regime, there's a small blip out there.
Yep.
This is when China corrected its death data by 50% on a single day.
That's right. They said they changed, got more data, and they changed the number. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's when you see the blip. But by and large, if you compare it with the full democracies, even when you compare full democracies to flawed democracies where you do have some civil rights, you still see that there's a lot more variation around the long run, around the 7-day moving average than it is in the other countries. So basically what we did was we took this deviation around the moving average, constructed what is the maximum deviation and the minimum deviation, the absolute value of that, just to pick up in a simple way what this deviation is, right. Standardized it by the population of the country, because, for example, in New Zealand, a deviation of 50 could be much larger than a deviation of, let's say, 1,000 in India, because we have 1 billion people, and there you'll have a couple of, there the population would be in millions. So we standardize it by the population, essentially to sort of compare apples with apples. And what we actually see essentially is a pattern that emerges, which is that you find far more deviation in democracies than you would actually find in authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes and even flawed democracy. This sort of is a measure essentially that, look, in countries where institutions are strong, where there are checks and balances, as much as an elected government would want to control this data, and it's not that they don't try to control the data, they do. But because of the presence of the media, because of the presence of other institutions, it is very difficult. The
watchdog, the monitors, they won't allow them to do it to the same extent.
Yes. To the same extent, right? So I'm not saying that people are more innocent in democratic countries. That's not the case. But it's just that the institutions are strong enough that manipulation becomes extremely difficult in democracies versus in authoritarian countries. Okay. And this is what we do essentially is we take this deviation around the 7-day moving average and then relate it to various factors which we think could also potentially explain the nature of number of infections and the number of deaths. Okay. So what we do essentially is for each country, we compute this deviation and we relate it to per capita income. One of the arguments could be that most of the democracies are richer countries. They have better abilities to test, and because they test, you find more number of cases. But our argument against that would be essentially that, yes, it is true that they can test more, identify more number of cases, but what about deaths? So if, if in India we are not testing enough.
Harder to fake the death data is what you're saying.
Absolutely. It's much harder to fake the death data. And as I had mentioned earlier, 92% of the deaths are concentrated around democracies. So basically, our result essentially was to relate it to various factors that we think are related to the pandemic. So we then looked at second factor, which is trade as a percentage of GDP.
Okay, let's see. Can we move to the graph that shows these things?
Okay. So now, if you look at, for example, this sum of maximum and minimum deviations per 100,000 people around the 7-day moving average, you clearly see a pattern, which is for democracies, this deviation is much, much larger compared to non-democracies. Yeah. And this is more so for civil liberty, which basically measures the freedom of press.
Yes, I see.
And the reason why I put civil liberty out there, because of late, or in the last decade or so, there has been a discussion around democracy recession. And one of the factors that is getting curtailed across countries.
Recession, you said.
So more countries, particularly.
So people are worried that the level of democratic rights are going down across the world. Is that what you?
Yes. So in
Amartya Sen's famous paper, which showed that in democracies, famines almost never happened
Yeah.
because we had checks and balances, and the governments and civil institutions made sure that people would not starve.
No, absolutely. And this is what this is the pattern that you're observing. And this is coming out of controlling for various factors. So we've controlled for trade as a percentage of GDP. So it could be because countries, democratic countries trade more, they have more relationship with China. But we know from the epidemic literature that you don't need a large influx of people for the epidemic to start. It can
Yeah.
start with 10 people, as low as 10 people.
For the lay people, let me explain that the idea here is that if you run a relationship between just authoritarian government and the degree of deviation, one might worry that is it really authoritarian or something else that's correlated with it. And the
Absolutely.
idea of controlling is to make sure that this is not these other factors that are leading to this, but indeed what you're trying to measure here. Yes.
So the factors that we controlled for Bhagwan were we looked at trade as a percentage of GDP. Maybe the more you trade, more likely you're going to have an exposure. We looked at health as a percentage of GDP. We also looked at geographical factors, and it turns out that geography is playing an important role. There has been an argument that has been made, which is that countries that are north of 40-degree latitude are much more severely affected by this epidemic compared to the other countries.
And do you find that it is indeed the case that countries in high temperature zones have smaller incidence?
Have smaller incidents, right?
The data confirms that.
The data confirms that.
Yeah.
Now, what is also confirmed essentially, Bhagwan, is that we find this pattern only for deaths. But when you look at cases, for example, you don't find this pattern. So when you look at number of cases, so you see rapidly the number of cases rising in Russia, you see it happening in Turkey, it happened in Iran, it happened in China. But when you look at the deviations in terms of cases, you don't find it, but you find the deviations in terms of deaths.
Okay.
Now, Bhagwan, I want to
explain to me one more time why that is the case.
Well, Bhagwan, you see, in terms of cases, it's okay for a country to have high level of cases. I mean, for Russia to be able to justify that it has 1,000 cases might be very difficult, right, on a day-to-day basis, because it has relationship with China. There is mobility. If you are seeing high number of cases in other countries, then it'll be difficult for you to be able to sell to your citizens that, look, we don't have high number of cases. Now, North Korea has been able to do it, but we don't have any data from North Korea. But for other authoritarian countries, this becomes extremely difficult. But
it is less important. As you said earlier, it's less important. Yeah. In fact, if the number of cases are high and you can still claim the number of deaths are low, you look even better.
Absolutely. So that's the whole idea that, look, we have high number of cases. So if you look at Turkey, for example, the recovery has been much faster than the kind of recovery we are seeing in Germany, the kind of recovery we are seeing in Italy, the kind of recovery we are seeing in Spain. So Turkey, in fact, has turned it around in a very quick period of time. If you look at the number of deaths in Russia,
that's what the data is saying. But are you saying that it may not be true?
Well, you see, what we are saying essentially is that there's something which is not right, which is coming out from the data, which is, if this is truly an epidemic, if this is something which is not very easily understood across the world, how is it possible that some countries recover much faster than other countries?
Yeah.
So you see, at the end of the day, we haven't yet found what is the best procedure to adopt when a patient has COVID-19. It is still under test. It is still under experiments. People are coming up, but it's too early to say. But to find the pace of recovery in one country differing from the other sort of raises alarms. What is it that these countries have discovered, whereas the Western world, which spends much higher percentage of its GDP on health, has not been able to discover, right? So we then look at several factors, like it could be age, maybe older people stay in democracy. Yeah. We control for the share of older population as well, and we find a similar result.
So Bhagwan, like good econometricians, you are saying that we want to rule out these alternative explanations uh,
Absolutely.
just to be able to focus it to one.
Absolutely.
What are you willing to say about India? What do you see in
Well,
data?
if you look at India in these graphs, Bhagwan, you'll notice India is an outlier.
Outlier
For
in two ways.
It's an outlier because based on its civil liberty score, based on its democracy score, the number of deaths in India should have been much, much higher.
Hmm.
Now, unfortunately, in India, we've seen very low death numbers.
Yes.
Now, it's puzzling people across the world. But my biggest fear essentially with death numbers is that India has many more infectious diseases as well. We have almost more than 1,000 people dying of TB. We have more than 1,000 children dying on a daily basis due to some neonatal infectious causes. So
Okay.
now,
Let me make sure. I think you're making an important point. You're saying, given that the extent of deaths caused by other factors is relatively high in India, um, this effect should be smaller. Is that what you're saying?
well, see, Bhagwan, in India, deaths are not registered. As many deaths are not
Deaths
registered.
are
The
not.
registration of,
Okay.
most deaths are domicile deaths, right, in India. It's not everybody dies in the hospital. We have death registration which are very low. In certain states,
What do you
they're
think
like,
is the percentage? What percent of deaths are actually registered in the registrar's office in India? Do you know?
see, well, we do have data on that. The death registration in some states is more than 80%. In states like UP and Bihar, it's less than 50%,
Less than
right?
50%. Okay.
Less than 50%, right? So if you in fact look at children's death, that number is much, much lower. For example, we computed that number for Bihar, for example. In Bihar, it is expected to have more than 100,000 children die, but less than 1,000 deaths are registered of children, right? So the death registration is very low. Now, what I'm trying to say essentially is that in India, we have many more causes of death other than COVID on a daily basis, and due to infectious diseases itself, right? And if most of these deaths are domicile, would it really raise an alarm if there are deaths which were supposed to happen due to TB now happen due to COVID? How will we identify which death was due to which, right? So that poses a big challenge in terms of our death data. But essentially what we are not seeing is influx of patients into the hospitals here in
Yes, that's
cities,
what I was,
right?
and that's what has given me hope that, we don't see our hospitals being overrun.
Absolutely.
We were worried
So
about.
there is something about India, and I must, say it on your program, that I think the government over here took a much more proactive stance much sooner than many other countries.
And
Just
much
to give
more
you an
stringent,
example.
much more stringent, yeah.
So in January, when India had one or two cases, they put restrictions on people traveling from China. Like they put restrictions on people traveling from Japan. Now, if you recall, they had a travel advisory out on March 12th from people coming from Europe. That is when in Italy and Spain the cases are going up. At that point in time, India's numbers were in 3 digits, right? We go in for a national
The reported
lockdown.
numbers, the reported
Yeah,
numbers.
the reported numbers, of course. But at that point in time, the numbers were not, because I was looking at some of the data on severe acute respiratory infection. We looked at several hospitals to see if the number of SARI cases had actually gone up. That had not happened in India. So
Mhm.
I think they did impose restrictions. A very proactive stance was taken by the government. And I must give them credit because, India is not known for taking very proactive stance. You sort of react to the situation as it emerges. But putting travel restrictions, and I'll give you one more instance, which I found fascinating in the Indian case, that you had number of students in Wuhan, right, when the epidemic was peaking in China. India decides to evacuate them, quarantine them, and bring them back home. Now, this to me is a very proactive and a positive step because if suppose Wuhan opened up early, and we know that number of tourists, a number of people
Yeah,
who had traveled from Wuhan to other countries had actually been instrumental in spreading the virus around.
like
But
in the case of Italy, we know that
like in
that
the case
would
of
played a
Italy,
very
absolutely.
big role. Yeah.
Had they come on their own, it would have been very difficult to trace them. It would have been very difficult to quarantine them. So I think India is an outlier, in my opinion, because we took certain proactive stances,
So
right?
you're saying India is an outlier and you can't tell whether it's because we did the right things
So
or
at this stage, we cannot disentangle whether we've done the right thing. What seems to suggest that we have a very vibrant media, I would say, media that is, looking for stories, that media that is present all around. So if the cases were going up, let's say even in a particular village, in a particular area, I would imagine that somebody would reach out and provide that information. Now, right now, we haven't seen even the media, which is, and I'll give you one more instance. Take, for example, Gorakhpur. A Gorakhpur incident happened where 67 children died in a hospital, if you recall, almost 2 to 3 years ago. That became national news, right? So I believe if any incidents like that was happening across the country, that would come out as national news. It'll be very difficult in a vast country like India to hide that kind of information. But to say it is not possible is also not the right thing, because after all, India's politics is also interesting. You look at the center, which is accusing one of the states that they are underreporting their deaths. So there is an instance, there's a political game that is going on where the center has accused the state that you're not correctly reporting the deaths, so we need to go and inspect the number of deaths that are happening. So, but that's the vibrancy of democracy. That's the kind of competition. That's the kind of checks and balance.
yeah.
So
So
India,
often people complain that, media is biased, but what you're saying is as long as there are enough kinds of medias on different sides, that may be enough. So somebody may be biased pro-government, other may be biased anti-government, but given that you have both of these, it will be hard to fool all the people all the time.
absolutely. And in India, I think, you look at Gorakhpur instance, you had the center's government in power, you had a BJP government in the state. You can't hide this kind of information very easily. You can't cover it up. It gets out, it gets reported, and given the kind of attention COVID has right now, it'll be very difficult for governments to hide the death. Now, where manipulation
One thing that is
happens,
different about this crisis, Mudit, is that we have much more social media activity, and that has made information flow almost freely. So it's even more difficult. I think what happened during the Spanish flu was for long periods of time, we didn't even know what was going on. I mean, that's why we ended up calling it the Spanish flu, even though Spain was not the worst affected country. But now this has become much more difficult because of Twitter and internet and email and television.
absolutely. And Bhagwan, everybody has a cell phone right now. Everybody is a newsmaker if you think of it. Forget about Twitter. I mean, I believe WhatsApp can spread a lot more information, even from an individual who's not a news reporter. This kind of information really comes out very quickly. But so far we've avoided it. I would want to give credit, in terms of the proactive stance. But instances do happen. What is a COVID death? Because it's not well defined. The governments can, to a certain extent, manage that information. But given the federal structure we have, if the state wants to hide it, then the center wants to showcase, no, you can't hide that information. So this federal structure is also beneficial.
And that tension is actually helpful. Okay.
That tension is
This
extremely
is
helpful.
really fascinating work, Mudit. I have to really thank you for bringing these insights. And I am really happy that we are able to showcase what economists and statisticians can do with data. The basic idea is the same. It's really patterns and looking for differences in patterns. What we do for detecting lies on a normal basis is also say, something is not right. The pattern looks different. You guys do it with data, with lots of data, and with a lot of care. Uh, this has been really, really insightful. And I look forward to seeing more work from you on this as we go along.
Sure. Thank you, Bhagwan. Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah.
I think
There'll be a
this
full
was great.
paper
I think
on
this
it.
was great.